it's really helpful to understand that these translators, who both the New Testament writers would have been using, they're understanding it to be giants. One of the struggles that people have when they're reading their Bibles is the concept of the Nephilim, the giants. So we've introduced this, but we want to go back. We know we talked about the book of Enoch, and we'll get to that and the demons, but we have to clarify and set up a foundation. And so a lot of arguments are made saying, really, the Nephilim just mean the fallen ones, whether it's fallen humans, fallen kings. So Doug, talk to us. Why is this not the fallen ones? Why is it that translation from a biblical standpoint, it doesn't work not only in the narrative, but for the rest of Scripture?
Okay, so there's a couple of reasons. One would be contextual, and the other would be just etymological. Mm-hmm. So the verse, Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So you have three words that are going on here in the Hebrew, and two of them are what really matters for us here, Nephilim and mighty men. Now, the word Nephilim, you'll hear most people will say, oh, that means fallen ones. And so there's a verb, nephal, that means to fall. And so the idea is that they fell from heaven or something. That's probably where a lot of people get the thought that the Nephilim are actually fallen angels. I hear that all the time. And they're not fallen angels. We talked in an earlier program about how the sons of God are the fallen angels. They came into the daughters of man, and they're producing Nephilim. So Nephilim are the offspring of the fallen heavenly beings. Mm-hmm. So they're half sons of God, half daughters of man. They're what mythology calls the demigods. So our Hercules, Achilles, Perseus, any of those kinds of guys is the counterpart in like Greek mythology to what we're looking at here. And I'm not saying that this is a myth in terms of being a fairy tale or whatever. I'm just saying that this is a story that's known around the world, and that's the best way that I can help people understand what the text is claiming here. So,
can I jump in real quick, Doug?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's even in the Greek mythologies, they have this story,
right?
Where
they have the gods all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Just like the flood narrative, you've got multiple flood stories. You have stories where you have these gods who are creating demigods. And so it's not saying that the Bible based it off that, but the idea of this happening is not just centralized to the Bible itself.
Right. It's ubiquitous idea. So in the same way that Christian apologists will use the flood myths of the world to say, look, everybody knew the story. The Bible's just telling the same story, but it's telling it from the true perspective. That's all we're saying here, is that this is a myth that everybody knew. In fact, Francis Schaeffer at one point says something along the lines of how more and more we're coming to understand that mythology has some kernel of truth, historical truth to it. And then he reads this verse. So
that's right.
I mean, Francis Schaeffer, you don't get any more reformed guy than that.
No.
At any rate, the word Nephilim only appears one other place in the whole Bible, and that's in Numbers 13. That's the story where the spies go into the land of Israel, and they come back with a bad report, 10 of them, and they tell Moses, they say, look, we went in there, and we're not able to defeat these tribes because we're like grasshoppers in their sight. And then it talks about how gigantic and tall they are. Mm-hmm. So that's a contextual clue here that we'll also talk about when we get to Deuteronomy, and that we've already talked about really with Goliath. I mean, we're talking about creatures that are monstrously huge. Mm-hmm. So there's a reason why they were afraid. If you didn't have faith, and only two of them did, you'd be afraid too. These are not normal entities. The entire world was afraid of them.
I mean, just to jump in, sure, were they exaggerating that the grasshoppers versus them? Probably, but they weren't exaggerating to the point where these were 7-foot people versus 5-foot people,
or even
6-foot
worse,
people.
with Goliath and the Septuagint height, he's 6'9", and
Right.
King Saul is 6'6".
Right. Yeah. Oh, I'm pretty sure got three. Yeah,
you.
three. That's right. But it's important that, sure. I found this fascinating too, that Joshua doesn't correct them. He doesn't say, "What are you talking about? There's no giants in the land. You guys are nuts. We can take this." He doesn't say that. He just says, "We can take it." He doesn't say that they were wrong. And I think that might be a story might be an argument from silence. But I think it's still a very strong argument that Joshua and Caleb are like, no, we can still do this, even if that is true. Which I think is, important to, when you're looking at the narrative of it, that, and just from a story standpoint, you've got God who just brings them out of Egypt. He's provided for them. He's shown them his power and his might. And it is a little bit of a slap in the face of God of like, well, he delivered you from Egypt. You don't think he can take care of some giants? You're going to go wander now. 40 years. Sorry. Anyways, back to the Nephilim.
Yeah, I mean, well, the verse before where the Nephilim is found here, it says that, this is the report they gave, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be a reference to cannibalism.
Right.
Okay. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. So that's the verse prior to the grasshoppers. In the last verse, this is where the word appears. And there, Numbers 13:33. And there we saw the Nephilim. And then it has, in the ESV, it has in parenthesis, which I think is fine, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. Mm-hmm. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. So the contextual point here is that even though it doesn't say giants necessarily, although we'll come back to this in Genesis 6, it does say that they're giants here. They're of great height, and then it says that they are actually the sons of Anak.
Right.
Okay. And that's a guy who appears later in the Pentateuch and then into the book of Joshua. But so that's the first one. Then the second thing is the etymology. So in this verse, the word Nephilim appears 2 times. But the thing is, it's not spelled the same way in Hebrew. You would not know this from looking at the English because it's spelled the same way in the English, but it's not spelled the same way in the Hebrew. And the problem is when you look at the one that has the extra yod or y, there's no way to account for how you get that spelling with the verb nephal.
Right.
So there's only one way that you can actually account for it, which is that it's actually an Aramaic word that means a giant. Now, Aramaic is a cousin language to Hebrew, and it's the language that everybody was speaking after the temple. And so it seems to be that this second spelling is actually a gloss that was added later to help the people understand what it was that they were reading. Okay? Because they had time for them. This was a long time ago, even for those people, in the days of Ezra or whatever. And so they insert an Aramaic word here to explain to them that this means giant. Now, if we went back to Genesis 6, what you would see is that there's a translation of the Old Testament that we call the Septuagint. This is the Greek translation of the Hebrew. And it was done about 200 years before Jesus by 70 Alexandrian Hellenized Jews down in Egypt. And they actually chose the word gigantus to translate Nephilim. And the word gigantus is very well known in Greek mythology because it means a giant.
Right.
So there you have confirmation in 2 different ways that the word does not actually mean the fallen ones or to fall. Although I do think that there's probably a word play going on there, but it's only a word play. Yeah, they're fallen, but they're giants. And
that's right.
So now all of a sudden, when you see this, you have to ask yourself, how is it that the sons of God coming to daughters of men produces giants? And, we dealt with that a little bit when we were talking about the sons of God and being heavenly
Right.
beings. That's the explanation for it. One other thing I think is worth pointing out before we move on is that the word mighty men is the word Gibborim, and the Septuagint actually translates that as giant as well. So it actually translates two different Hebrew words with one Greek word.
That's right.
Very interesting. The next time that word will appear is with Nimrod, who it says became a mighty man on the earth, or became a giant. And Nimrod, throughout all the scholarly work that's been done on who he is almost always associated with one of the demigods of the ancient world, somebody like Gilgamesh or Orion or Hercules. It just depends on who you're reading. But the point is that even he, through the word gigantus, is connected back somehow to these Nephilim.
Yeah. Let me jump in here real quick, Doug. I know this was helpful for me when I was first in seminary. A lot of people don't understand how the Old and New Testament work. So you have the original writings of the Old Testament, which is going to be majority Hebrew, and then there are sections of it that are going to be Aramaic, like in Daniel and certain of the prophecies. And then you have a large shift in the world where they're speaking Greek now. So, 200 years before Christ comes, they're now using the Greek translation. So we have an English translation of both. They had a Greek translation of the Hebrew, and that's what they were reading. And so it's safe to, I'm going to make sure I say this correctly, but a lot of times when the New Testament writers are quoting the Old, they're using the Septuagint. Is this correct?
Yeah, not all the time. I mean, it's I think it's more than 50% of the time.
Right. So they're aware of it, and what's helpful here is they are making translation, and they're also making interpretation. That's kind of what the argument that Doug is making here, is that you have the Aramaic translation and you have the Septuagint Greek translation, and they're both translating it not as fallen ones. That's right. They're both translating it going, these are giants. And this is really helpful just from a linguistic. This isn't new. This isn't some kind of a new phenomenon based on because, everybody's excited about aliens right now, and so we're just super, we're turning everything into supernatural in the scripture. And we'll get into this a little bit, but the first 400 years of the early church fathers understood that these were angels and giants. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I just wanted to interact. If you're new to understanding biblical translation, it's really helpful to understand that these translators, who both the New Testament writers would have been using, they're understanding it to be giants.